Tales of the first English settlers disappearing from Roanoke Island have been shared for nearly a century.
England sent a group of pioneers to a strange land, and then they completely forgot about them. For 3 years, those 117 souls waited for ships that never appeared on the horizon.
Archaeologists spent the past few years digging up new evidence, now being given the stamp of approval by top researchers.
Now, modern science has finally tracked down their biological fingerprints, and the truth about their fate is deeply unsettling. It's not a story of survival, but of a slow, forced transformation into something else entirely. The crazy part is, the clues were there the whole time, hidden in plain sight. Let's dive into the evidence that suggests the mystery was solved a long time ago. The genetic proof that changes everything. The legend of the lost colony has haunted the American coast for centuries, but the ground is finally giving up its secrets. For a long time, we thought 117 people just evaporated. But recent DNA studies have uncovered something that changes everything we thought we knew about history. Researchers from the Lost Colony DNA Project have been collecting samples from families living in the Outer Banks and the surrounding areas. What they found was a set of genetic markers that shouldn't be there. Specifically, they discovered mitochondrial DNA lineages that trace back to 16th century Europe, appearing in people whose families have lived in the region for hundreds of years. This isn't just a coincidence. It is a direct biological link to the very people who supposedly vanished. But here is the disturbing part. These DNA markers are often found in families that identify as Native American. This suggests that the 117 settlers didn't just meet their end in a forest somewhere. Instead, they were forced into a desperate struggle for survival that led them to abandon their culture, their religion, and their language to merge with the local tribes. For a 16th century Englishman, this was a fate worse than passing away. They were supposed to be the start of a new empire, but instead, they became a footnote in the history of the people they were meant to displace. The genetic data shows a high frequency of specific haplogroups in families with names like Sampson, Barry, and Scott, names that appear on the original passenger list from 1587. The science of genetics allows us to look back in time with incredible precision. By comparing the DNA of these modern families to samples from the United Kingdom, scientists have found a match that is too strong to ignore. This proves that the settlers moved inland and integrated, but it raises even more questions. If they survived and had children, why did they never try to contact England again? The answer might lie in the sheer desperation of their situation. When you are starving and alone on a coastline thousands of miles from home, your primary goal is to stay alive. The DNA tells a story of people who were resilient enough to endure, even if it meant losing their identity entirely. What most people do not realize is that the disturbing nature of this find comes from the realization that history is much messier than the books lead us to believe. We like to think of the settlers as heroes or victims, but the DNA shows they were just humans trying to survive. This new evidence points to a specific path they took, moving from the coast toward the interior of North Carolina. This area, now known as Site X, has become the center of a major archaeological investigation. Excavations there have turned up fragments of English pottery and metal tools buried deep in the soil, right alongside Native American artifacts. The DNA and the physical evidence are finally lining up to tell one cohesive story. But here's the catch. The ground holds secrets that the written records never could. The 3-year silence that sealed their fate. The tragedy of Roanoke began long before the people disappeared. In late August of 1587, John White stood on the shore and watched the sails of his ship disappear as he headed back to England for supplies. He left behind 117 souls, including his own daughter and his granddaughter, Virginia Dare, who was the first English child born in the Americas. The plan was for him to return in a few months, but the world had other plans. It's not that simple, though, because a global war was brewing thousands of miles away. As soon as White reached England, he found a country in total chaos. Spain had assembled the massive Spanish Armada, a fleet of 130 ships intended to invade England. Because of this, Queen Elizabeth I ordered every single English vessel to stay in port to defend the home front. White was stuck. He begged for ships, for supplies, for any way to get back to his family, but the war came first. 1 year turned into 2, and 2 turned into 3. For 1,095 days, the 117 people on Roanoke Island were completely alone. They were living on a narrow strip of land only about 8 miles long and 2 miles wide, with limited resources and no promise of help. Imagine being one of those settlers. Every morning you wake up and look at the Atlantic Ocean, hoping to see a white sail on the horizon. Every night you go to sleep knowing your food is running out. By the second year, the tension must have been unbearable. They were surrounded by tribes that were increasingly hostile because of the actions of previous English expeditions. Earlier groups under Ralph Lane had been aggressive and had even taken the lives of local leaders over a stolen silver cup. The 117 settlers were paying the price for sins they didn't commit. When the war with Spain finally ended, White was finally able to secure passage on a privateering ship. But when he finally arrived back at the island in 1590, the silence was deafening. There were no signal fires. No one came running to the shore. The settlement was surrounded by a high palisade of trees, built like a fort, but the houses inside had been taken down. It wasn't a scene of a massacre. It was a scene of a move. Everything of value was gone. The settlers hadn't just left, they had packed up. Yeah, about that, the carvings weren't a sign of panic, but a calculated map for the future. Decoding the message left in the wood. White walked through the empty settlement with a heavy heart, searching for any clue. That is when he found it. On one of the main entrance posts, the word Croatoan was carved in clear, capital letters. On a nearby tree, the letters CRO were etched into the bark. This was the moment the mystery was born. But for White, it was actually a relief. Before he left in 1587, he had agreed with the leaders of the colony that if they ever had to leave, they would carve their destination into a visible place. He also told them that if they were in trouble, they should carve a cross above the name. White looked and looked, but there was no cross. To him, this meant the settlers were safe. They had moved to Croatoan Island, which is now known as Hatteras Island, about 50 miles to the south. The Croatoan people were led by Manteo, a man who had traveled to England and was a firm ally of the settlers. It made perfect sense. If the food ran out or the water turned bad on Roanoke, they would go to the people they trusted. However, fate was not done being cruel to John White. Just as he was preparing to sail south to find them, a massive storm hit the coast. The Atlantic off North Carolina is known as the graveyard of the Atlantic for a reason. The weather turned violent overnight, and the ships lost their anchors. The crew, afraid of being destroyed by the gale, refused to go any further. They forced White to turn back toward England, leaving his family and the rest of the 117 colonists behind for the final time. He never saw them again. For centuries, people have looked at that word Croatoan and wondered if it was a curse or a secret code. But the truth is much more practical. It was a street sign. The lack of the cross is the most important detail that most people miss. If there had been a struggle, those people would have left the mark. Instead, they left a clear message that they were relocating. But why didn't they just stay at Croatoan? Some believe they split up. The DNA evidence suggests that while some went south to Hatteras, a larger group might have headed 50 miles inland to the mouth of the Chowan River. This would explain why artifacts and genetic markers are popping up in two different directions. They weren't just one colony anymore, they were a group of survivors scattering to find the best chance of life. And get this, the tools they left behind tell a story of long-term survival rather than a sudden end. The real reason history kept them hidden. For a long time, the idea that the English settlers lived among the Native Americans was kept quiet. In the centuries that followed, the story of a lost colony was much more useful for creating a sense of mystery and drama. But the physical evidence found by archaeologists in the last 10 years is undeniable. At Hatteras Island, researchers found a specific type of copper ring. This wasn't just any jewelry, it was made of a copper alloy that was only produced in Europe during that time period. Even more telling was the discovery of a rapier hilt, a type of sword used by English gentlemen in the late 16th century. These items weren't traded, they were used until they broke. The most shocking find was the hammer scale. When a blacksmith works iron, tiny flakes of red-hot metal fly off and land in the soil. This is called hammer scale. Archaeologists found this scale in layers of dirt that date back to the time of the Roanoke colony. Native American tribes in the area did not work iron in this way. This proves that an English blacksmith was set up and working on the island long after John White left. They weren't just guests, they were building a life. They were repairing tools and perhaps making new ones to trade for food. Inland at Site X, the finds are just as significant. Pieces of a specific type of pottery known as borderware were found. This pottery was manufactured on the border of Surrey and Hampshire in England and was commonly used by the Roanoke colonists. Finding it 50 miles inland, buried alongside local pottery, is the smoking gun. It shows a physical merger of two cultures. They were sharing hearths, sharing meals, and eventually sharing DNA. This is where the story gets truly unsettling for those who wanted a clean ending. The settlers didn't die, they became someone else. The reason this stayed a mystery for so long is partly due to the politics of the time. When the Jamestown colony was established in 1607, they went looking for the Roanoke settlers. They heard rumors of people who dressed like them and lived in stone houses further inland, but they never found them. Some historians believe that the local leaders of the Powhatan tribe might have meted out justice to the survivors to prevent the new English settlers from gaining more power. But the DNA says otherwise. It says they were already integrated so deeply that they couldn't be found as English people anymore. The crazy part is, the survival of the 117 was a success story that history tried to frame as a failure. The final truth behind the ghost colony. So, after 400 years, we finally have the answer. The mystery of Roanoke isn't about a ghost or a massacre. It is about 117 people who were abandoned by their country and chose to survive by any means necessary. They left the island in 1588 or 1589, moving toward Croatan and inland toward the Chowan River. They dismantled their houses to use the wood for boats or new shelters. They took their tools, their blacksmiths, and their hope, and they walked into the woods to find a new home. The thing is, I wonder if we are missing a key detail about how they felt. Imagine the moment they realized no ship was coming. The realization that they had to stop being English to keep breathing. That is the truly disturbing part of the Roanoke story. Not the disappearance, but the erasure of an entire group of people into another culture. They are still here, though. They are in the DNA of the people living in North Carolina today. They are in the pottery shards buried under feet of soil. They are in the very name of the land they tried to claim. The story of the lost colony is finally being found, and it's a tale of resilience that goes far beyond what we ever imagined. It turns out that history doesn't always end with a bang. Sometimes it just quietly blends into the background. If you were one of those 117, would you have waited for John White? Or would you have walked into the unknown? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's greatest mysteries. Would you choose survival over your own identity? We will see you in the next one.